Tachle, warm greetings, friends. From Drakpa. I'm enjoying doing these short little video responses with some friends I'm in correspondence with, and just kind of juicy questions are coming up, and instead of kind of writing them out and just trying to see what it's like to have little like video interludes. So here in Amma and my kind of greenhouse on a little rainy morning. So sending love to everyone. Of course, beginning generating bodhicitta. May this be for the immediate and ultimate benefit of every single being. Be happy and achieve enlightenment as soon as possible. So the particular question that I'm kind of percolating with since last night that I got from a friend, Bruce Alderman, who's just a sweetheart and also a brilliant, pristine mind. The question is there any particular reason why all the Yanas need to have originated from the same figure, such as the Buddha, who may have offered teachings outside of the gross realm, in order for the teachings to be considered authoritative or worthy of inclusion? So again, is there any particular reason why all the Yanas have to have originated from the same figure in order for the teachings to be considered authoritative or worthy of inclusion? And the just straight up answer is no. There's no particular need or necessity for that to be true. We can see this with the 9 Yanas, the 9 vehicles of Nyingma school approach to Tibetan Buddhism. All the teachings of the Buddha are completely liberative. They'll all bring lasting happiness and immediate benefit for self and other. Even the outermost first Yana vehicle level of Theravada, foundational Buddhism, the Sravaka Yana, the teachings that the Buddha offered at that Yana, that level or layer, that kind of worldview making of this foundational Buddhism, it's liberative. And there's a clear path. So it's all based on the Four Noble Truths, and there's a clear path to getting liberation of self from all the causes of suffering. And so that would be liberation, like the cessation of all suffering, because the causes of suffering have been removed. So is there a need to see that the Buddha or such a being taught all the yanas, all the 9 levels? So this is one way of kind of first addressing this question, is at least in terms of a liberative path, there's no need for all the 9 yanas. Because even the first yana, the Theravada foundational teachings, are liberative. And they bring tremendous benefit for others. The 4 boundless qualities: immeasurable love, immeasurable compassion, immeasurable rejoicing, immeasurable equanimity. The great equality of seeing all beings is equally caring for them all. And so they're all liberative. So what's the benefit of seeing that the Buddha, or like kind of entertaining the possibility that the Buddha taught these additional teachings? Because clearly in the Vajrayana teaching, it said that the Buddha during his lifetime didn't publicly speak or share the Vajrayana teachings amongst human beings. He taught them in the celestial realms. And so this is what the Buddha taught, that he didn't share these at that time to human beings. So right off the bat, we have to be open to entertain, to suspend disbelief and entertain the possibility that there are these more subtle realms populated by more subtle beings who have their own worlds and world making and histories and languages and all that comes with being a being in a world with other beings. And that's where he taught the Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhist teachings. That was around 600 or so BCE. And this is what the Vajrayana, the Buddhist Vajrayana teachings, teach. And they say what the Buddha said in the sutras, like that. Even in the sutra of Heart Sutra, the Buddha was said to be silently in meditation, as his 2 students, Avalokiteshvara and Shariputra, are heart of wisdom. That Shariputra asked Avalokiteshvara in Vulture Peak Mountain, Rajagiri, about the nature of dependent arising, and it was Avalokiteshvara, through the blessings, the wisdom blessings of the Buddha, who sat silently, to respond with what came to be the root teaching, the Heart Sutra. And that's classified as like a teaching of the Buddha via the power of blessing. So even to entertain this kind of a possibility where you have actual figures in a, actual meaning like literal empirical figures in a literal empirical place saying things, and the Buddha presiding, like through the power of his formless blessing power, that's actually said to be a teaching coming from the Buddha and not from Chenrezig or Avalokiteshvara. So this requires a tremendous openness of mind. Like basically, there's to like locate the question. There's a tendency, and I would say in more like industrialized or like age of reason, kind of like a value sphere called modernity that appreciates rationality, logic, verification, falsifiability of evidence. That in this kind of a context, which is called a scientific context, which is extraordinary, it's so beneficial. That in that worldview framing, there are certain standards of empirical verification, and they usually are related to the 5 sense doors, sometimes the 6, our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and then mind. So these 6 sense doors, we have to directly verify according to certain classifications of evidence, and evidence gathering and then corroboration amongst other experts who've done those, the requisite tests in the proper way. And we test and see how reliable a certain theory is. That's just a basic scientific process, and these kind of worldview making systems. But it's all quite literal according to the so-called normal, or our usual range of functional eyes, functional ears, and then that can be enhanced with technology like microscopes and telescopes and all kinds of different machines can make that our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind more sensitive and more computationally processually powerful, with computers and supercomputers and possibly quantum computers and all that. So in that game framing, in that language system, in that way of modeling, in that way of knowing the world we're in, there's certain standards. And so according to those standards, what would be the benefit of believing that the Buddha taught these less literal or more subtle teachings, like the Heart Sutra, for example, or that the Vajrayana teachings were originated when Buddha taught to invisible beings in other realms that aren't accessible according to these normalized or kind of our more typical commonly accepted scientific modalities in human terms. What's the benefit? Is it necessary? No. You can take a more evolutionary approach and see that in the history of hundreds of years that different Buddhists have come and expanded on and deepened the teachings of the Buddha, seeing it more from a historical material perspective. That's for example, the Buddha only taught the outermost teachings, and then gradually over time other masters, scholar practitioners came along and expanded and deepened those teachings, drew out the logical implications of those teachings. And that's where Sutra Mahayana came from, and that's where Tantra Mahayana came from, and eventually this non-dual traditions, for example, the inner tantras, and even into Dzogchen and Mahamudra. That could be a more material historical lens that a lot of people in modernity, world making, are more comfortable with. And you can see it that way, but so what's the benefit of seeing it that way, and what's the limitation of seeing it that way? Basically that the Buddha was, a very smart being who could abide in emptiness, and this waking up, and then see according to the range of our normal sense door, sense faculties functioning with exceptional logic and rigor. I think there's the careful kind of holding is that we need to be open, have an open mind, that it's possible the Buddha did that thoroughly and did a lot more. If we can entertain an openness of mind, a kind of a what if maybe fresh, vivid, thoroughly scientific perspective of, well, maybe the Buddha did have these more subtle level capacities. Maybe he did teach these more subtle level teachings that we weren't yet available for, or we weren't in the room where it happened, kind of thing. That maybe that's possible. Maybe some things aren't verifiable within the certain sense doors or cameras or certain ranges of machines that we have according to the tech currently available, even the most sophisticated technological machines that humans have produced thus far. It's the openness of mind that ends up being key. The 9 yanas will work either way. whether we believe the Buddha taught them or these great lineage masters afterwards the Buddha taught them. But however we land with that response, whichever way we believe it, it's going to define the world-making system that we're understanding experience through. So this integral meta-theoretical genius, Sean S. Bjorn Hargens, he has this really helpful kind of heuristic that I've gotten a lot from, and it's this: the who times the how times the what. Who times how times what is a given worldview we're in. So the who is the interior subjective epistemology. How am I knowing? The how is the method. How's the method that my knowing is operating through? And then the what is what's the world, or what's the object? What's the objective and interobjective world that I'm in, the ontology that I'm actually engaging? So what's the epistemology with the methodology, with the ontology? Those come together kind of seamlessly in every moment. We're assuming these three components at least, this who, the how, the what, to create an elegant, seemingly given real experience, which is a moment of mind experiencing a world or itself. So there's always these three layers, at least: epistemology times method times ontology. And so in Buddhism, that's called view, or tawa. And so what view am I holding? So they say depending on what view I'm holding, that'll always depend on the result. That'll be the origin, or the source, the foundation of what result is possible. Because according to that world-making or world-shaping, that co-creative kind of worlding of the view, of the worldview, of the enacted embodied worldview, of me in culture with others, supported by material infrastructure called society, so self, culture, nature, that locates the result of what's possible in that arena, in that game, in that dream, in that world. The view, it all depends on the view. So Buddhism's really strong on this point, that there's always a view followed by a sustaining the view called meditation, followed by integrating that with your lived experience called conduct, followed by what's the result. How does the world interact with itself? Once we have that world with its rules according to that view, then we get how that world functions and what that level of causal kind of like pocket or that set is possible. Like what's the range of possibility within that set making or that world making, that set of counteractive dynamical systems. That's all defined by the view, sustaining itself, integrated with like these different layers of experience: body, speech, and mind, self, culture, nature. And within that, we have a game, or arena, a dream, a shared context, and that defines the possibilities of what's available within that context. And so always comes down to the view. And so what's the view we hold if we see that the Buddha was just operating only at this very refined, or kind of like normal refined sense doors, versus a much more subtle level, relative truth, and also a pure relative truth, called pure relative truth, or how enlightened beings seeing it definitively without trying to dumb anything down for like beings that aren't yet available or capable of seeing in such a refined way as enlightened beings. As beings that are like, we're always filtering our things through much like very contracted epistemology, a contracted methodology, a contracted ontology. And so what's it like when you can free flow with any kind of epistemology and any kind of method and any kind of ontology world making that follows patterns? So that doesn't break cause, condition, and effect, or karma, but does that, like, there's no holes barred. Like, it's full spectrum range of possibility according to what's mutually omni-win beneficial with the bodhicitta impulse. So that's kind of the platform of the question and how I'm answering it. So the Theravada begins with the most literal exoteric ways of viewing, meditating, conduct, integration, and result. And then the Sutra Mahayana expands and deepens that. Tantra Mahayana expands and deepens that. And Dzogchen includes all of the ways and the waves of enfolding epistemology with method, with ontology. And so Dzogchen said to include all of them. That's why it's great perfection. So the so-called more integrated or more inclusive versions like would be Sutra Mahayana and Tantra Mahayana. So what's the benefit of seeing the Buddha that way, as if the Buddha taught those too? Well, if we're in a view that entertains the possibility of such a thing as Tantra Mahayana, of Tibetan Buddhism, and we don't only hold ourselves to a Theravada view of what the Buddha taught, what's the benefit? Well, then there's a lot of different teachings on what's the distinctions between Sutra and Tantra. There's so many teachings on this, or what's the distinction between foundational Buddhism and Sutra Mahayana. Those are really quite extensively taught by the Buddha, and I'm not going to go into all those details right now. But so essentially, so what's the benefit of seeing that the Buddha did that? So because if we can entertain a view currently that's like, say, the most inclusive view, or allows for this subtle realm, or these subtle relative truth seen impurely through sentient duality, epistemology, method, and ontology, and also through pure relative truth, that is, pure body, pure speech, pure mind, or pure epistemology, pure methodology, pure ontology, so how Buddhas, or how noble beings, who aren't filtering things through grasping self-absorption or an exaggeration of self, kind of like unidirectional, kind of closed loop, meaning making, but much more interdependent, internested, counteractive dynamical system, a much larger way of being an adaptive system. That's pure relative truth. So we have to be, if we want to be like at least practicing Tantra Mahayana, we need to be able to hold the view that such things are possible. There is such a thing as impure relative truth and pure relative truth. There is such a thing as, like, very gross level, like, relative truth, and very subtle level relative truth, even when that's seen just impurely. And if we can entertain those possibilities, then more nuanced or inclusive views are off the table, and so are more nuanced and inclusive worlds and world making, and also the results from entertaining those possibilities. So if we get a little fundamentalist and say this is the only way, this way I'm viewing, this way I'm testing, this way I'm comparing, if that's the only way, that's called fundamentalism. And we can do that in any way of world making, even very high, very nuanced, very integrated, very deep and profound ways. Like anytime we take an edge as being a final boundary, that's called fundamentalism. And so whenever we're doing that, we're actually breaking a chain of interdependence, because we're saying this is the frozen, fixed, definitive, permanent edge. And in terms of dependent origination, like, that's just not true. That's a mistaken belief. It's a dogma. So we can look at this, like, pull back and look at the Buddha's outermost teachings and see if there's a sense of that they're coming from this postmodern or integral or middle way view. We can look at an outermost teaching such as like the Four Reliances taught by the Buddha. We can look at such a teaching and see whether it's integrated or not. And so the four reliances, what did the Buddha taught? And this is the outermost Theravada foundational school teaching. It's a very famous one. And the Buddha said, don't rely on the teacher, but the teaching. Don't rely on the literal meaning of the teaching, but the subtler level of the meaning. And then don't rely on provisional truth, the provisional way of making sense, of understanding the meaning, but the definitive way of making sense. And then don't rely on your constricted duality consciousness, rely on your natural wisdom awareness. And so these four reliances, this outer teaching of the Buddha, so don't rely on the teacher but the teaching, don't rely on the literal but the more subtle, don't rely on the provisional but definitive, and don't rely on duality mind, habituated duality mind, but non-habituated wisdom awareness, or wisdom. And we can see when we look in a certain way that this is actually showing, it's pointing towards like how to get into an integrative mode, an integrative view or world-making system. When the Buddha said don't rely on the teaching, the teacher but the teaching, he's saying, you have to test this for yourself. Look at the doctor's prescription, not the personality of the doctor. Like what's actually the rigorous kind of steps they say to take. don't just, don't judge a book by its cover. Like, look at the logic. Like, look at the actual integrity of the song, of the logical stream, of the mathematical calculation. Like, actually look at the teaching. And then secondly, look at not just the literal meaning, but also the more subtle level meaning. So this first wave, or the first injunction the Buddha's teaching, not to focus on the teacher but the teaching, is to say, don't fixate on an unhealthy pre-modern view, but go into a modern view that actually values verification. And then the next move is to move from an unhealthy modern view of certain kinds of verification only to include a spectrum of more kinds of verification, of evidence gathering. So that's when the Buddha said, don't rely on the literal meaning, but also the more subtle layers of meaning. So not just one way or one set or one method of verifying, one epistemology, one ontology, but a layered, more nuanced, contextualized way of making sense of a world with a variety of methods. So this is saying go beyond unhealthy modernity fixation and open up into healthier post-modernity contextualization, multi-perspectivalism, and just the plurality of perspectives in coherent ways, like following, internally following rigorous, coherent pattern making and testing. So rigorous ontology, rigorous epistemology, rigorous methods, not just like haphazard heapism, but like actually thorough, pattern making of cause, condition, and effect. And then the third injunction is don't rely on your provisional teaching, but definitive. So like contexts are layered. So like how deep into context can you go? So even, in postmodernism, you can take that in an extreme way, the unhealthy version of postmodernism, and you get to this nihilism or narcissism, which is based on deconstruction only, where you say it's only ever shifting contexts, sliding signifiers. But here, Buddha taught there's actually a definitive truth. And this is where he's pointing to absolute truth. And so that's when at this point of the teaching, it's saying going beyond unhealthy postmodernism, go to post-postmodernism. And this is where the two truths distinction taught, like relative and absolute, taught by many traditions, but very much so by Buddhism as well. Specifically, it starts in the Sutra Mahayana, like in an explicit way. But definitive truth is like actually this absolute truth. So what is unchanging? What is the nature of dependent origination? It's emptiness, or empty of being fixated, frozen, stuck, permanent, singular, independent. So this is more of the definitive truth teaching. And so here the Buddha is saying going beyond unhealthy postmodernism into healthy post-postmodernism, or healthy integrative or integral. This is when the Buddha is starting to talk about the middle way. This mind, like the middle way Madhyamaka teaching, integrating the two truths. There's dependent arising, and its experience is emptiness. There's emptiness that always arises as internested cause, condition, and effect. So there's form, and its nature is emptiness. Its absolute nature is emptiness. The absolute nature always expresses itself relationally as form or semi-form, as body or speech. And so then the fourth injunction the Buddha taught in this exoteric teaching is don't rely on conditioned mind or duality mind, but rely on unconditioned awareness or wisdom mind. And so here the Buddha is saying, don't get stuck on unhealthy post-postmodern, right? Where you only have this absolute emptiness thread that only sees the impure relative truth, what's verifiable according to this certain limited set of sense doors called duality mind, but expand it to include wisdom awareness, which in the Buddhist teaching is said to include pure relative truth as well. How the Buddhas see things, how enlightened noble beings see things on the Bodhisattva levels, Bhumis, and also like fully unsurpassed Buddhas. Like when they're seeing definitive truth through wisdom awareness that isn't funneled in any way through duality mind. So how do they experience things? So the Buddha's teaching us to do these, and so that's called healthy integral or healthy postmodern, going beyond even an unhealthy integral that's fixated on its way of sense making while integrating emptiness or absolute truth. You actually need to expand into pure relative truth sense making, or kind of ways of being, knowing, and doing, becoming, integrated with emptiness, or like the total flex flow dependent origination or interdependence of awareness with body, speech, and mind. So you need to actually have this, what's called inner tantras, or pointing more towards the Dzogchen view of great purity in union with great equality. Great purity is pure body, pure speech, and then great equality is pure mind. And so you have pure body, pure speech, pure mind, and that's just to say an enlightened way of experiencing reality, an enlightened way of doing chemistry, an enlightened way of having methods of liberation, an enlightened way of understanding and making poetry, art, parenting. There's an enlightened way to do it that's not funneled through duality mind. It's actually just an expression of wisdom awareness. And then there's an unenlightened way, or duality way, called impure way. And so the benefit of like believing that the Buddha did both of these ways, like basically that the Buddha taught sutra and tantra, that the Buddha taught, according to this esoteric teaching, is pointing us to go from pre-modern to modern, from unhealthy modern to postmodern, from unhealthy postmodern to post-postmodern or integral, from unhealthy integral to beyond integral, into what's next. And that's called Tantra. So this is, again, just a formula. Like we have to live this in our experience. And as this goes into the West, with Bruce also brought up, like, according to the theory, like, this sounds great, but how is it actually lived? And that's where we're parsing, what did the Buddha teach compared with how do Buddhists practice it? How do they live it in their real life? And as Buddhism goes into these Wild West kind of spiritual, industrial, complex scenarios, we need to be really clear about what's the actual theory. Like, what are the proper mathematical calculations? And once we spend enough time and really getting good at doing those calculations, then we learn to like have playful, elegant finessing, like see if there's any more boundary opening that we can do. But we need to give ourselves enough time, as Trungpa Rinpoche mentioned, like as Buddha Dharma is going into these new places that don't have a history of Buddha Dharma being there. We need to be extra careful, or extra kind of like in a healthy way conservative, a healthy preservationist kind of modality, to not lose the internal like formulas, the internal logic, the internal first principles that are shown and demonstrated to work over centuries of time in a variety of other countries and other contexts, specifically in Tibet, in the case of Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana teachings that originate in India. We need to not lose the first principles during the first 50 years of it being transplanted in a new place. So we need to get really intentional and like develop a knowledge base and a body base that can actually understand and start to integrate the first principles before we start to see where the first principles might bend, where there might be new room for, like, in a different context, for them to be contextually sensitive and adapt in different ways. So we need to master the set. We need to master the technique before we, can elegantly kind of reshape it at its like really adaptive edges. We can't do that as beginners. That's like what experts, or that's what you have to have expertise in order to have that level of mastery skill to really be totally naturally aligned with Buddha Dharma all the time, for example. So then you can like co-creatively like see what is the deeper structure that still has this wiggle room to be adaptive and go even deeper given a context. We need mastery. Like basically we need integral elegance. We need to be able to like be in this variety of view making, variety of epistemologies, variety of ontologies, variety of methodologies. We need to seamlessly, elegantly, with integrity and dignity, move between them without breaking the systems. And so that's called a nine-yana view. Like we need to be able to have that elegance. And so I, of course, assumed that the Buddha had that elegance, because you can like logically see how it's implied in various exoteric teachings, like the one we quickly went over with the four reliances. That train of logic is implied. Like the Buddha's saying in the outer teachings, like keep going deeper, keep analyzing, keep loosening, look more carefully, open, expand, deepen, like refine your conceptual intelligence, open your heart to have like the post-conceptual way of integrating that and absorbing that, of being that, of transforming yourself into wider, deeper, more inclusive views and sustaining those views in integrated behavior, conduct, to have a bigger, more integrative, like more systemic or holistic result. That's just going through the 9 Yana systems. So can we believe the Buddha did that? That he was able to do that before? And if we can't believe it, like, why not? I mean, what's the good reason that such a being, like, hasn't yet done that in the vast history of beings, of humans and more than humans? Like, why would you really think that that's impossible? Like, why not open the possibility of that could have happened? And if that could have happened, so what if, maybe, what if, like, what's the benefit of allowing that kind of possibility? That the Buddha might have already been integral or post-integral, teaching on subtle or imperceptible kind of beings and world systems according to technologies that we don't yet know. Like, that there could be the possibility of 6 realms of beings. There could be the possibility of eons before our, Big Bang, Big Crunch cycle of this universe. This is all exoteric teachings of the Buddha. He taught these much more subtle level relative truth teachings that's just typical according to what I can see with my human eyeball and my human ear and my human nose. Like, the Buddha taught us such an incredible diversity of teachings, even at the most exoteric Theravada tradition. And if we're not willing to go beyond that, we've just limited the discourse that we're available to participate in. We'll only play this certain game. And typically that game is like a historical, material, scientific game, which is a brilliant, beautiful game. We can do all kinds of amazingly powerful things and all kinds of amazingly powerful destructive things. The beauty in the destruction, like, is vast. But like what I've referred to in this topic, to like kind of bring it to a close a little bit here, not wander too kind of far, is like Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche, this great Vajrayana master, did a foreword for Alan Wallace, Lama Wallace's book, his translation of Dudjom Lingpa's Vajra Essence. And then that foreword, he said really specifically like why Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche hasn't been that interested in engaging with dialogue with scientists. And it's basically that I think he's saying in this foreword that I'll like post below, that he thinks that framing or that boxing, that game making, the world shaping that the scientists are willing to entertain in order to have the dialogue is so tight that almost all of Buddhism doesn't fit in that box. Buddhism can play that science game, the empirical game of science, verification, corroboration. It can do that really well. It can thoroughly do logic. And a lot of scientists like Buddhism because of that. They say it's like a science of mind. And it is that. And Buddhism is much more than that. It is a way of life. We can look at it. Anyway, not to go into the ways that it's like a healthy pre-modern, healthy modern, healthy postmodern, and healthy post-postmodern system. Like, it is a healthy way of integrating like initiatory ritual practices and meaning-making, community and belonging and self-other good, healthy, harmonious dynamics. That's healthy pre-modern. It has very rigorous modern scientific verification systems of logic and like math, of astrology, it's just, it also postmodern is contextually so sensitive. It has a plurality of perspectives, internested views. It encourages multi-perspectivalism. It includes this deep diversity of like actually coherent layering together of different ways of perspective making and perspective living embodiment. And then additionally, it includes integral. It includes like seeing the larger connective patterns between these different ways of being. They're not fundamentally contradictory. It just depends on what view you're holding. And once the view is set, the game is set. And once the game is set, you have to play the game fairly. That's just how we are in good faith with each other. But to move between game making, according to what's helpful, that's the integral impulse. And then to go beyond integral and include this much more subtle range of 6 classes of beings, past, present, future, the previous universe cycles, like this kind of out-of-the-box range that's not typically allowed by scientific verification according to empirical, age of reason, European-based analytic philosophy and sciences of various types. Like, that's not entertained, it's not allowed, let alone pure relative truth or tantra. It's just not in that game making, so they don't entertain it like with seriousness. But the open-mindedness is the key feature here. And in terms of Buddhism, Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche is mentioning in that foreword, there's specific things that Buddhism allows for that goes beyond science, science 2.0, science 3.0, science 4.0, that Buddhism entertains thoroughly with rigor that the modern material, historical, sociocultural science making doesn't yet entertain. Buddhism includes the possibility of transcendence, of transcending or going beyond the limitations of these six sense doors. It includes a possibility of liberation, of fully waking up from constricted, self-obsessed, self-distorted self-contraction, self-other contraction, these more limited games. It includes liberation from these cycles of unrealistic holdings of certain like causal patterns within the set. Like it includes this greater flexibility and emptiness, this dependent origination on much vaster, more nuanced scales. So it has teachings on selflessness or egolessness. It has teachings on wisdom. There's a possibility of definitive truth. So these are things Buddhism does that empirical science isn't yet available for. Buddhism is fundamentally rooted in beyond these six sense doors. There's a yogic, direct, valid cognition, both in the sutras and the tantras. So there are such ways of like having supramundane abilities with eyes, ears, nose, tongues, bodies. You don't need a microscope. You can actually train yourself, your sense doors, your mind, your cognition, to actually have these enhanced, not superhuman, but more human capacities called siddhis, or these abilities. They're in the sutras and in the tantras. So this kind of yogic direct valid cognition is like thoroughly through the sutras and tantras, and that's not yet entertained seriously by empirical science. Empirical science often doesn't include a two-truth distinction. They don't make a distinction between relative and absolute. That starts happening when you get into integral or integrative mode. Before that, it's seen only as relational, or only relative, and only relative according to this certain boxed ways of seeing relative world making. So it's only provisional truth. It hasn't yet included definitive truth. So you don't yet get this two truths distinction that's in Buddhism and Sutra Mahayana explicitly, in foundational Buddhism implicitly, and in Tantra Mahayana in like full array of even includes pure relative truth in union with absolute truth. And typically empirical science of all kinds, I'm talking physics, chemistry, neurology, psychiatry, like there's so many sciences, right? It also doesn't include like so much of this subtle cause, condition, and effect. It has to fit within these six sense doors. And so methods that use more subtle cause, condition, and effect, like torma making, lama dancing, ritual embodied mudras, different making of mandalas of different kinds, sonic mandalas, form mandalas, sand mandalas, like that's all off the table as like these tech that actually brings together more subtle arrangements of cause, condition, and effect to have a more systemic or a more holistic, a more integrative way of viewing, of being, of integrating, and of having results of how to live in a world with others. Like, so Buddhism, that's like bread and butter Buddhism, and specifically Vajrayana Buddhism or Tantra Mahayana. And so Buddhism is up for having these conversations with scientists. It's just the box of conversation by this certain empirical scientific modality is so small compared to like these logical implications and direct teachings that have been expanded on by Buddhists for centuries, and then if you believe it, historical Buddha himself, in other realms. So and then it's just, you have to, if you believe in, future lives, past lives, the Buddha taught in Mahaparinirvana Sutra that he would come back 4 Gregorian years later, he'd be more enlightened, his name would become a Junye, born of a lotus, and that according to Tibetan Buddhism, as they interpret that teaching, Buddha reincarnated, or his wisdom mind re-emanated as Guru Padmasambhava, born as an 8-year-old boy on a lotus in the sky with no parents, didn't pass away leaving a material body, just vanished in a variety of ways, that it had said to have a transcendental wisdom rainbow body, spread the Dharma teachings, highlighting the Tantra Mahayana or the Vajrayana teachings, and overcoming forces that were not comfortable yet with that level of teaching. That's Tantra Mahayana. Guru Rinpoche also subdued these forces, or you could also say like brought about their bodhicitta so brightly that they like became convinced bodhicitta is the only way, and they used all their abilities to like support bodhicitta, both in its sutra and tantric expressions. So that's all in Tibetan Buddhism. That's like standard Vajrayana, and that said that the Buddha taught that in India, and that was then preserved by Dakinis in space, and then came back through Vajrapani, and through Vajrapani to the 5 Mahasiddhas on the top of Shripad, Mount Malaya in Sri Lanka, or was taught by Vajrasattva to the first human recipient of Dzogchen, to Garb Dorje in Uddiyana and Svat Valley. So these are like, this is all of a sudden all this Vajrayana story making comes online, not as just another story, another myth, another superstition, which, you know, empirical science sees it just as superstitious myth, like another story. But when we include these enhanced, like science 2.0, 3.0, other ways of entertaining, like how these views might work with their method, their like meditation, conduct, and fruition, all of a sudden we get this surplus or abundance of additional varieties of ways of you know, having epistemology, methodology, and ontology in the world with others. And that's what Sutra Mahayana expands into, like Zen. That's what Tantra Mahayana like more expands into more deeply. That's Vajrayana, and even Dzogchen, Mahamudra, and all these vast traditions of non-dual traditions integrating relative truth thoroughly, coherently. That's kind of their bread and butter. And if we're not available to entertain that kind of possibility, I think that's called it's a great filter in Buddhism. If we're not yet willing to stretch that far, to open our heart that big, to have our mind that big, we're just not yet available for that view. So that view comes with the meditation then's not available, the conduct's not available, the result's not available. So we lock into whatever view is like the widest, deepest view we're comfortable with. And if that's Theravada foundational Buddhism, that's wonderful. It still brings liberation. And if it's modern empirical science, that's wonderful too. But just because we have a view that works for ourselves and like has power and active power in the world, I can put someone on the moon, doesn't mean that's as far as the views go, or the methods go, or the conduct goes, or the results go. We have to be willing to entertain open-mindedness that is very precise and logical. It's not so open our brain falls out. It's like open and very precise. It always has discerning wisdom, prajna. Like it has permeable, intelligent, permeable boundaries. There's always the prajna component of showing up in relation, in interdependence. There's always emptiness and dependent origination. There's always this wisdom and the compassion, the engaged, embodied, compassionate inclusion that's always done intelligently, skillfully, with wisdom. And so this is a kind of a few reflections on why we don't necessarily have to believe the Buddha taught the 9 yanas, what might be some of the benefits, because all of a sudden there's all this variety of other views, meditations, conduct, and fruitions that become available when we start to see that the Buddha did such a thing. And even if we don't yet believe the Buddha historically taught that, but later masters did, and they are legitimate, and we want to practice those teachings, we can still do that as long as we hold open the possibility that the Buddha might have done that too. And so they say the view is going to define the result, and how, so specifically in Vajrayana, how we see our teacher, what view we see our teacher as, is going to define how far our practice goes. So if we see our teacher as a normal human being that's extra nice or extra like wakeful, that'll be as far as we ourselves can develop, because that's the game we're in. That's the world making we're comfortable with. If we see them as a bodhisattva, that's as far as we'll go, Sutra Mahayana. If we see them as a Vijayadhara tantric master, that's as far as we go. If we see them as a full embodied expression, multi-layered, transcendental wisdom rainbow body of the 3 kayas, like Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya, pure body, pure speech, pure mind, to like pure 3 kaya Buddha, that's as far as we'll be able to go. Like that's the limit of the game, the result that we can get. And by seeing the teacher that way, we'll start to be able to open the door to see everything that way. Everything as being the 3 kayas, for example. And that's the function of a teacher. To like, we localize such a big worldview making in one place, a teacher who's an expert scholar, an expert meditator, a scholar practitioner that's reliable. We test that, we verify that, we develop a very strong trust. And then we commit to that pathway, that way of engaging reality. And that teacher is pointing us to learn how to see gradually, and with explosive threshold kind of breakthrough moments, but like how to see everything as being the teacher, everything as being the three kayas. Our self, our culture, and our nature are all seamlessly, elegantly expressions of three kaya, of pure relative truth in union with great equality, great purity, great equality. So they're pointing us towards the lived, embodied, fully integrative, immersed, all qual, all, you know, all cosmic address inclusion of like post integral ways of being, which is like union of sutra and tantra, which, you know, Wilberian integral is just not available for yet, and that's fine. It's not available for that, and it's just, what's the benefit of holding that tightly, and what's what you lose with like holding a wider view that has additional ways of having epistemology, methodology, and ontology. So that's the question, Bruce and others. Hope it's just kind of wax poetic on this thing. Doing these short videos just because, I don't know, writing is kind of going out of fashion. The visual field seems to be the one, and these little longer formats are just like, there's more availability to go a little deeper and not just have these short little reel video TikTok clips where you can get a tiny little taste and almost no context. So I like appreciating and honoring both the atmosphere, so that dialogue or dialogos, so these threads have a little space and time to weave with each other. I'd much more prefer an active conversation. I'm more of like a conversational person myself. That's kind of where things kind of pop on and align in response with others, and what others see that I don't see. They kind of show me the bad habits and occlusions, the different blind spots I have, and can really kind of massage that. So I appreciate this back and forth with people. And when that opportunity comes, like more in real time with shared time with people, and not just these long monologues, but like, I love it. You know, I'm available for it. So hopefully it's helpful. If any of it's helpful, go for it. And if any of it's not helpful, I'm sorry. Apologize. Just like that's my error. So take what's helpful for you, and then we'll just dedicate the merit quickly. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. The precious bodhicitta, and those without it, may it be generated. Those who have it, may it never diminish, but always continue increasing. Deity, mantra, and dharmakaya are the nature of appearance, sound, and awareness, the pervasive kaya and wisdom display of the Buddhas. May practitioners of the profound and secret great perfection remain inseparable from the innermost, one-taste awareness of wisdom mind. All love. Thanks, friends. Thank you.